It's me, and I'm coming to you from my kitchen because we are still going to do some e-learning while we are stuck in quarantine. So the topic for today is the different types of questions that will show up on the free response, and that is now the only section that will be on the AP exam this year, is just a free response section. That's good and bad for some of us. Some of us, we're good at multiple choice, and if we had an option there, we can guess, but it looks like for this year, it's only going to be free response. So I want to talk about the major types of questions that will show up and kind of what the expectations are for each of those questions. The first question type is a lab-based question. Those are typically longer and they're worth like 12 points apiece. And in the lab-based question, they give you a sample set of data, and then they ask you to usually graph or make interpretations from the data set. Typically, they'll have some derivations or follow-ups that you'll have to do with that section of data. So one of the more involved types of free response questions, and that's the lab-based question. The second is a 12-point quantitative translation problem. So in that one, you're using equations or formulas and showing your mathematical ability to solve and get to an answer. Sometimes it's just with variables, so you're just doing algebra and showing the derivation of a problem. These are the derivation type ones that we've been practicing and working on all year. Other times they actually have you compute and get a quantity. So it kind of depends on the question setup, but they give you a scenario and then you have to use equations to get to an answer. The third one, or the third type, are short answer types questions. And the short answer questions can be anything where you're just showing your qualitative explanation, and kind of like, this is where they'd have like two students are arguing about a problem. Explain why student A is more correct than student B. And in these, you're not usually doing a lot of math or equation or derivations, but you're doing more just explaining of concepts. And the last type of question is the paragraph length response. This really could be embedded in any of the previous questions, but one of the questions should have a paragraph length response, and there's specific requirements for that. And I'll go over each of these in more detail next. Right, so next I just want to cover some general advice for the free response section. First of all, I want you to be aware that you can't really game this. It's not like, oh, as long as you do X, Y, Z, you're going to always earn 1 point per question. Each rubric is independently made up for each question. So instead of trying to look for patterns in old tests and say like, well, this gave them a point on this one and this didn't, here's just some kind of general tips to follow. First, make sure you write down the formula that you're intending to use if it's a mathematical derivation. Sometimes just credit is awarded for writing down the conservation of energy or conservation of momentum principle. And if you wrote that out in variables first and then try to break it down and solve something, that might give you credit. If you're not exactly sure on how to solve, but you know other parts of the problem, at least explain what you do know. So let's say you're working on something with centripetal force and you say, well, I at least know that the force should point to the center of the circle and the acceleration is towards the center of the circle because it's in uniform circular motion. Therefore, and you may not get all of the points, but at least you showed understanding of that principle. So that's always good to do. You want to make sure you get straight to the point when you're writing. They don't want big strung out paragraphs and lengthy responses. Most of the questions you should be able to answer in a couple sentences, if not like a single word. The only one that requires more of your writing is the paragraph length response. And on that one, you kind of walk through a theory of, or a strategy of, what is my claim that I'm making? What is the evidence for that claim? And what is my reasoning for that claim? So it's a strategy of kind of systematically working out, like, this is what I'm saying, this is my evidence that I have to support what I'm saying, maybe based on equations and other things, and then the reasoning, here's the logic that goes into that. If you get stuck on a free response, move on. Go to another one and then come back to the one that you're working on, that you're struggling with. That can help you make sure you maximize your time. And don't be afraid to kind of draw diagrams and charts and pictures to help yourself explain. They can't just go off of a diagram alone. You would have to write up some understanding as well, but you can kind of use that to reference in your writing. Also, just general rule is if your approach to a problem is taking anything longer than like 15 minutes, it's probably wrong. There's no question that's designed to take that long for each little section. So it'd be best to move on, especially with this AP exam being all free response with 45 minutes in total length. I'm guessing that the questions will be kind of chunked out and reduced rather than just having like 2 big questions. I bet they'll have several smaller questions from different topics. So we're going to take a look through the 2019 AP1 free response questions just to get an idea about what type of questions these would be. And so taking a look at number 1, this is a 7-point question. It's got these blocks that are going to smack into each other, and there's things with looks like kinematics and motion and energy. We'll actually work through some of these problems later, but just classifying this type. As I scroll down, some of the things they want me to do is we have to graph the speed of the center of mass over the course of time, so we have to show graphical relationships. We have to conceptually say which of the sphere's angular momentums will change due to this smack. So you have to kind of, that's a conceptual ranking based on your understanding of what's going to happen with angular momentum for this system. And then you have to briefly explain. Briefly will just mean a couple sentences of explanation, not big long paragraphs. And so that is just what we call a short answer question. It's pretty, it consists of just a graph and a couple conceptual questions. There wasn't a lot of math and derivation or anything like that. So that's a short answer. The next one is an Atwood machine, and says this one should take 25 minutes. And kind of the indication of time helps you determine what type it is. Typically the longer ones are either lab-based or the qualitative questions, whereas the shorter ones will be just the short answer. So for this one, there's a lot of qualitative questions at first. Just suppose this would happen, estimate, or just briefly explain without deriving equations. So this is just where you show your conceptual understanding of what's happening. You have to draw free body diagrams. What else? Considering different scenarios. Derive an equation in part C. So this is the qualitative, quantitative question, and that's typical that they would take the longer amount of time. It just, on this printout, they don't give you this space here. On the actual AP exam, they'd have much more room for you to write down your answer. All right, on to the next one. This is a 25-minute long problem, 12 points. It looks like springs, launching some sphere out. And you got students that are hypothesizing kind of like in a lab-based scenario. So you're supposed to state principles that would explain this, just so those are conceptual questions, but then down below, you can tell this is a lab-based experiment problem. They want you to talk about the quantities to be measured, the symbol for quantity, the equipment. So you'd have to kind of show your understanding of how lab situations would work and what you would do to set up that lab and only collect the variables that are needed. And then after they do that, they have you follow up and describe your procedure, describe what you would graph, how you'd get a certain result to show up. So that's what the lab-based question would look like. Again, that was supposed to take 25 minutes. If you think about this new structure, there's only 45 minutes total, so they're not going to be able to ask you this many of the bigger questions, but just kind of getting a feel for what they look like. Number 4 of that year's exam was a circuit with a motor and lifting a block up, so we got mechanical energy. This is, you're determining an expression using a little bit of math, and then in a clear, coherent paragraph length response. So this was the paragraph length response. You see how they word that. It may also contain figures or equations, justify why your selection would decrease the amount of time. So they're pretty clear on what they want you to write about, but we want to stick to that claim, evidence, and reasoning pattern that we talked about before. The last one, 7-point question, looks like 13 minutes, will be another short answer. Within that, there is calculations showing your understanding of the math involved, but I wouldn't call this the qualitative relationship one, because you're not deriving through math and expression. You're just kind of solving that and then answering conceptual questions about the length of the tube. So this is, again, like this topic here, we're not going to get to, that's in waves. And the topic up here was about circuits. And so the types of questions might show up, but the content is going to differ on this exam coming up. So that's what we need to be ready for. So as we start practicing more problems this week and into next week, we will identify those characteristics with each problem that we do. Thank you so much for sticking it out through this virtual lesson, and I hope you have a great week.